We've all seen the chaos that have been playing out in airports all around Europe and the United States during the last few weeks, where passengers have been queuing for hours just to get to the gate and being told that their aircraft have already left. And in some cases, the airlines have been cancelling the flights altogether. Now, what is the underlying reason for all of this chaos? Is the famous pilot shortage finally here, even though we just came out of the pandemic? Or are there more factors in play? Stay tuned. During my entire 20-year career so far, I've been constantly hearing about the threat of a looming pilot shortage, but every time that it seemed that it was about to happen, some kind of disruption happened to the pilot industry. Before 2020, there was a lot of rumors that now, finally, this pilot shortage is going to become a reality. Both Boeing and Airbus had a huge backlog on their aircraft delivery order books, and anyone could clearly see that if the airlines was actually going to take delivery of all of these aircraft, they were going to need a lot of both pilots and cabin crew and support personnel in order to be able to pull this off, because the baby booming generation, the great generation from the 50s, 60s, they were going to finally go into retirement. That had been postponed by about 5 years because of a change in rules that mandated the pilot retirement age change from 60 years old to 65 years old. But now a lot of these people were going to go into retirement and they needed to be replaced. But then along came 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, and now all of a sudden all bets were off. All of the airlines out there started to ground their fleets, at least partially, and that meant furloughing a lot of pilots and cabin crew, and in some cases also firing them. The flight schools out there, understandably, started to reduce the intake of new pilot cadets. So there was no new pilots being trained. And no one really knew how long this pandemic was going to last and what kind of impact it would have on the world and, of course, the aviation industry. This meant that it became really hard for the airlines out there to try to plan how they were going to deal with their employees that they still had on the payroll. Were they going to fire even more of them, or were they going to let people get out of check on their licenses, and how were they going to plan for a potential revival? No one knew whether or not these airlines would even be around in a couple of months' time, and certainly not in a few years' time. But pretty early on, in the autumn of 2020, there were some voices that started to chime up saying that this problem that we were talking about, the potential pilot and cabin crew shortage, the fundamentals for that is still here. These voices were not very strong in the beginning, but they grew stronger over time. And in the summer of 2021, United Airlines in the United States announced that they were actually opening up their own flight school in order to stave off the potential pilot shortage that they could see over the horizon. The same was true for Lufthansa in Germany, who already had a flight school like that, but hadn't been taking in cadets for a while. They were now doing so. And so was Ryanair, which is another European airline, and they were seeing this as a potential to preempt what they perceived as a real threat going forward. But how come that some airlines actually saw this threat coming and started mitigating against it in the midst of an unprecedented and ongoing pandemic? I mean, last time that the industry had faced a disruption like this was during the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and the time that came after that was a real chaos for the industry, where loads of airlines had to merge with each other, thousands of pilots lost their jobs, and the airline business was basically just hankering along for the coming 6 years. Well, the answer to that is because this crisis is fundamentally different than the crisis that happened after 9/11, because this time there was nothing structurally wrong with the airline industry. The airline industry was actually working really well. Yes, it had started to kind of slow down the growth it had seen the previous 6 years prior to 2020, but it was still working really, really well. And when the pandemic hit, that didn't stop people from wanting to fly. They were just forced to stop flying because of government interventions and lockdowns and things like that that we're actually still seeing today. But the underlying demand was still there. Now, it is true that there are some permanent changes to the way that some passengers are flying. For example, business travel has gone down and it's likely to continue to stay quite low for quite some time. And that's because of new inventions such as Zoom, for example, that have replaced some of the business travel. But the fact is that a lot of these business travelers, they didn't stop traveling. They just switched to a different type of travel. Private jet travel. During the pandemic, there's been a huge boom for private jet flying, and we're actually starting to receive reports now from some of the operators of large fleets of private jets that they're also having problems to find pilots to fly their aircraft now. And that is a big red flag, because those jobs have always been in demand, especially from new pilots who need to get in and build hours in the industry, which we'll get to in a second. So as it stands right now, not only did the pandemic not remove the underlying causes for the coming pilot and personnel shortage in the aviation industry, it looks like it might have potentially even made it worse. That's why I like to refer to the pandemic as the Great Accelerator, because it looks like all of the existing trends that were there before the pandemic hit have just been accelerated. And what do I mean by that? Well, as an example, we can talk about the retirement of the baby booming generation, the pilots that were born in the 50s and 60s. Like I mentioned before, they were due for retirement within the next 2 to 3 years or so. But of course, when the pandemic hit, a lot of the airlines chose to pre-retire some of their older aircraft fleets. So for example, the Boeing 747, the 757, and the Boeing 767. And that meant that the senior pilots who were flying those aircraft, they were now asked to take a new type rating, to train themselves on a new aircraft. Now, if they were faced with that, and during the pandemic, the stock market was going gangbusters, by the way, and a lot of these older pilots had their pension funds and their savings in stocks and bonds, they now saw that they had the economy to potentially leave the occupation early, to pre-retire and to enjoy the retirement a little bit longer. On top of that, some of the baby boomer pilots actually lost their job during the pandemic when their airline fired them, and those pilots would have had to start looking for a new airline to work for, which, if they could even find one, would have meant learning potentially to fly a new aircraft, new procedures, and maybe even having to move their family somewhere. All of that brought together meant that a lot of these baby booming pilots decided to pre-retire, which meant that those pilots permanently left the workforce much earlier than the industry had counted on. Another thing that I want to mention is that a lot of the pilots from my generation who lost their job in the beginning of the pandemic, they had no idea how long this crisis was going to take. It turns out that it's been taking almost 2 years. These pilots, they needed to find some way to support their families, so they found other jobs in other sectors, and quite a few of them started realizing that, I'm 40, it's nice to be able to go with my son or daughter to football practice and be home on weekends. I actually like this new lifestyle that I have. I've been an airline pilot. Now I'm working in a bank or as a real estate agent. My wife is able to work, which means we have 2 incomes. So I like this job. I'm not going to come back. And I think this is going to come as a big shock for the airlines, who are assuming that once things starting to pick up, which it definitely is right now, they will be able to just call all of their ex-employees that they let go, and they will all come running back. I don't know how big of a percentage of the pilots who were let go who is not coming back, but given the fact that I personally know maybe 3 or 4 of them, I am suspecting that it's a quite large percentage. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear here that we, the pilots and the cabin crew, we're not sitting in some kind of a vacuum in the aviation industry. What happened to us also happened to, and in some cases a greater extent, to all of the different levels of every airline out there during this pandemic. We've lost important co-workers on the ramp, in security, in check-in, in staffing, in every single part. And the way that the aviation industry works is that we're like a fine machine, right? And every machine have different components in it. And if we lose one cog in that machine, the entire machine starts shutting down. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the travel chaos that is now starting in both America and in Europe. As an example, in the Netherlands this weekend, KLM, who is operating into Schiphol, which is the main airport for Amsterdam, had to essentially stop operation into Schiphol for a few days because there was just too much people at the airport. And that was because of a crucial lack of security staff that could help the outbound passengers to get through security, screening and controls and get onto their aircraft to fly away. And this is just the beginning. We're just in the beginning of June of 2022 here. We still have July and August ahead of us, which are the main traveling months during the year. So it is very likely that unless something is done quickly now, we're going to see some continued chaos during the summer. Now, before we get into what solutions there might be to this problem, I just want to share this short message from my sponsor. Your morning routine can really make or break your day. I used to wake up in the morning just to reach for my mobile phone and start to scroll on Twitter, Facebook, and whatever other media outlet I could get my hands on. Browsing the internet just to get your head around what's going on in the world can be really time-consuming and exhausting. That's why I now use Morning Brew to stay up to date with current events, especially in the world of business. Morning Brew is an absolutely free newsletter that delivers all of the information that you need in very quick, digestible pills. It gets you up to speed on business, science and tech in less than 5 minutes. Morning Brew is really witty, relevant and informative, just like having the news read to you by your very best friend, but they're still staying true to the absolute highest standard of accuracy, transparency and fairness. If you are interested in the area of business, finance or tech, there's really no reason not to sign up for Morning Brew. It's completely free and it takes you less than 15 seconds to subscribe, so you have nothing to lose. If this sounds interesting to you, then go to the link morningbrewdaily.com/mentor now or click on the link in the video description below. Thank you very much Morning Brew for sponsoring this video. So what can be done about this then? Well, the sad truth is that for the coming weeks and possibly month, there's not too much that can be done. The airlines and especially the airports that are facing these disruptions, they are just going to need to try to hire as many qualified people as possible to fill out the roles that are missing. And the problem here is that while the jobs that they are trying to fill sometimes requires the candidates to work on very odd hours on every single day of the week with very short notice and sometimes out on the ramp in rain and cold weather, they're not paying more than a minimum wage job sometimes in a supermarket. So it's very hard to compete as an employer to get the candidates you need. And once you find these candidates, they need to be security screened. They need to have a background check that covers at least 5 years in order to get a airside pass. And on top of that, they also need to be trained into the roles, which might take a few weeks to months. Now, that's not a long time compared to, for example, training up a pilot, but it is a very long time if you're facing these kind of problems right now and you need to have it sorted before July and August starts. Now, if we're looking at the pilot side and we're looking medium to long term, we're facing a very similar problem there. And that's because the aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, they're now spitting out aircraft at almost the same rate or even higher as they were before the pandemic hit. But like I mentioned before, we have lost a lot of our colleagues and we are not seeing as many people going into the occupation from below. We're not seeing as many cadets. I went to a pilot expo just a few weeks back and it was striking to me the difference between when I was there a few years ago when there were literally hundreds of people coming up to me asking, how do I become a pilot? Now there was a lot of people that came up to me, but these were already trained pilots that were asking me, how do I get into an airline? And of course, that doesn't have to mean anything, but to me, it looked like a tendency of not too many people being in training, but people finishing their training and now going into the airlines. And that means that within a year or two, we're going to see some real problems with a pilot shortage because it takes an absolute minimum of 2 to 2.5 years to train someone from zero up to a position where they can apply for an airline job. And that's in Europe, because in Europe you can go straight from flight school and then apply to an airline. But if you go to the United States, they have created a system that makes this crisis even worse. Because in the United States, they have a minimum requirement of 1,500 hours for a new pilot to enter in and fly in an airline. This means that once you've paid for your training and you're finished, and that, by the way, is still a thing, the people who want to become pilots still need to pay to get their licenses to apply for the airlines, you might have 200 hours. So that is a gap of 1,300 hours that you need to fill in some way. And if you can't find a job as a flight instructor or flying cargo in smaller aircraft or something like that, well then you might need to pay your way in to get those hours before you can apply. So the airlines in the United States, they're already struggling to find cadets. And the way things work in the United States is that people tend to start off in the regionals, the smaller airlines. And then they will work up their experience there. And once they have enough experience, well, then they will be headhunted by the majors, United, Delta, Southwest, and so on. This is something that Mesa Airlines, which operate regional flight for American Airlines, noticed when they lost 5% of their pilot pool just in the month of April this year. So what's going to happen here then? Well, the movements of pilots are a very global movement. This means that pilots from many different nationalities are working in many different countries. And when a country like the United States is starting to rehire, what they tend to do is they see they need a lot of pilots, they increase the salary, the terms and conditions. This means that American pilots that might be flying for airlines in other parts of the world are now uprooting and going back home again. And this increases the need for pilots in those other parts of the world. And we're already starting to see this, where, for example, American pilots are going away from Australian companies, and those Australian companies now need to rehire. And that kind of trickles down into the smaller regional airlines, the low-fare airlines out there, and so on. So this is likely the beginning of what is going to turn into a big crisis for some airlines, and not so much of a crisis for some of the bigger airlines that can afford to pay higher salaries and to improve the terms and conditions. So what do I think about this then? Well, I want to start by saying that I love my job, right? Being able to get up in the morning to go out and fly my Boeing 737 to a nice destination, working with fantastic people for a great organization, has been a true privilege. But there's no getting around the fact that the industry has, during the last 2 decades, from basically when I started, been under constant pressure, where the ticket prices have been going down, the efficiency have been pressed upwards. That meant that fewer people have been doing the same amount of work, and the terms and conditions and the salaries have not really been increasing that much at all. This has most likely led to a situation where the feeling for young people is that becoming a pilot maybe is not as attractive as it used to be. And this pandemic has just further increased that feeling that there's a little bit of an insecurity in the business. Now, if we are going to be able to fill these aircraft that are on order with pilots to fly you guys to your destination during the coming years, we're going to need to change that feeling. We need to get young people, and especially women, to understand that this is actually a job that you can do in the future. This is a job where you have a future, where there is work-life balance, and where your employer understands that different parts of your life and different times in your life requires a different type of employment. So here the ball is in the court of the airlines and the airport out there. They are going to need to figure this out. And I think that the first step that we need to start looking at is how to train the right people, the people that we know would make fantastic pilots, in a way that they are not put under financial pressure for the rest of their life. We need to find a way where the pilot cadets don't have to pay over 100,000 euros or dollars in order to start working for these airlines who require their services. Now, I am really proud to have been part of an organization called the Airline Pilot Club, who was working on this very issue, as well as giving valuable unbiased guidance to anyone who wants to get into this fantastic industry and call it their own. And the Airline Pilot Club is still around. If you go to theairlinepilotclub.com, it's completely free. Then you can sign up there and they will give you guidance on which flight schools to choose, what to think about. They have a really good community in there as well. So if this is something that you're interested in, go and check them out. Now, check out this video next, which I think that you're going to find really interesting. Send in your thoughts about this subject. And if you want to support the work that I do here on the channel, then become part of my fantastic Patreon crew, or get yourself some merch. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.